Welcome to Common Sense. I'm John.
And I'm Ed. How are you today, John?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm good. It looks like fall is coming here to New England. It's kind of gray, getting dark early, and that time of year.
Excellent. Well, we actually have geese flying here, so that's always my favorite time of year, seeing the geese go over. So here we
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, so today, now that we're in fourth quarter, it's the 2nd of October, and here we are now. Suddenly, everyone's worried about making the end of year numbers or planning for next year, and so we're going to talk about one of those fourth quarter rituals, the annual planning process. And we're going to look at it from a variety of perspectives and see if the process can be improved, and also kind of pick at the premise of it in some cases. Some of the things that I think we'll talk about organizationally, we have to set budgets and we have to manage resources. So there has to be some kind of planning, and maybe there's no alternative to the annual cadence, but is it appropriate in a digital world? The question is, with things evolving so quickly, is annual a long enough or too long a window for some of the things? How do marketing planning and digital specifically align or differ in a largely digital age? Although you and I live primarily in a digital marketing world, there's other kinds of marketing, and maybe that is appropriate to plan in different ways. What's the difference between strategy, tactics, and tools? And should we even plan for tools? This whole question of such rapidly evolving SaaS products in response to known or kind of unknown customer changes in buying behaviors, et cetera, it creates some interesting questions. So I'd say, John, why don't you start us off? You spent years doing planning for your agency, for clients. What's valuable about the annual planning process, and what do you think is outdated or counterproductive?
Well, of course, it varies with each company and really by industry, and really it kind of depends on who you talk to within a company. So the word planning probably ought to be in quotes sometimes. But
right.
I think the places where it really works well, and some of the things we talk about in our book, Common Sense Revenue Growth, really have several foundational goals that are top of mind and really guide the whole conversation. And that's when it really works well. So some of those goals, some of those main pillars, if you will, are corporate strategy, which is the highest level, revenue growth, profit and loss, talent acquisition, culture, and so on. And then more and more, I think companies are really talking about the customer experience, as we've talked about a lot, across the entire continuum of their relationship with your company. So talking about that, and then alignment, sales and marketing and customer service, and really making sure that those three departments are working as one, operating from aligned playbooks that focus on the customer throughout the journey. Those things are often missing in companies, but they're still very important foundations that can guide everything you do, including budget. And then I think with those things in mind, the individual activities of each department ought to be supporting the overall corporate objectives. And, there are going to be debates and differences of opinion about resources, but the end game has to be the corporate goals. So putting those things together, discussing them, coming up with some kind of consensus. And if you don't do that, if you don't keep these things aligned with company values and some of the corporate goals, overall performance may disappoint the stakeholders overall. So it's really important to plan with not just the limited perspective of, for example, let's create X number of leads or X number of press mentions, and think more about reaching those higher goals. Then I think in recent years, one of the biggest challenges, especially when it comes to technology and tactics and even buyer behaviors, is that it's changing so fast.
Right.
So that means, annual planning may not be fast enough. It may not be agile enough. So locking in a set of tactics may become obsolete by the end of the year. So you really need to think about being more flexible. And I think, the companies that do that have those high-level goals that may be addressed on an annual level, but then also have these kind of mid-range assessments of what's going on and how to adapt, they're more successful than companies that are just rigid. So an example on the marketing side would be, one goal overall this year might be that we add more video. And, that would be a solid annual planning goal. But the tactics and technology and channels that are best used with video will probably change over the year. So you have to be prepared to adjust more frequently.
Right. So it's interesting. I think what I hear implicit in your description is the role of strategy and really corporate strategy. I mean, often I hear folks talk about the marketing plan and call it a marketing strategy, and you're describing something that's deeper. I mean, corporate strategy might include things like, 10% organic growth, 30% inorganic growth, entering a new vertical or geographic market, improving margins by 3%, developing revenue streams around data. We've talked about new products and new models that companies might be looking at, creating subscription revenue with a goal of, say, 30% of your total revenue within 5 years. Those are those kind of high-level corporate sorts of strategic goals that we need to make sure it's supporting. Marketing strategy needs to support that, as well as a sales strategy. And I love your example of video. I mean, that could be an area of emphasis, creating content that speaks to each role on a complex buying team for each stage in a buying journey, and developing the enablement content that supports BDRs and inside sales and field sales, and even creating material that will improve sales channel performance, not to mention, identifying product gaps that could be closed with acquisitions or inorganic growth. So the marketing strategy pieces need to obviously feed up into the corporate strategy, and then planning is very different than strategy, although often I hear companies that do planning and call it strategy. When the marketing annual plan might say, okay, given what we need to support strategically, what are we going to do? And, an interesting approach, I believe an interesting approach is something like what GE's Beth Comstock, the CMO, talks about, her 70-20-10 model, where you spend 70% of resources on the what's now, the core focus, the, creating leads, that kind of thing. Working on SEO, improving conversion rates on landing pages. 20% gets spent on what's next, and 10% on what's new. And that makes sure that you're allocating resources in a way that keeps your mind open to the kinds of things you ought to be working on, but not at the expense or ignoring others. It's important not to conflate strategy and planning, as so often happens. And that way, every decision that you make will feed up into what those higher level goals are. Absent those higher level goals, then you just kind of make a decision based on, how do we think we can get more leads this month? And that rarely is a good long-term sort of a play. And I think one of the things that I see is a mistake on the emphasis, the over-emphasis on the MarTech stack as outcomes, rather than just kind of a fluid combination of tools that supports execution of the plan. And the tools, from my perspective, are a means to the end. And people tend to think of them as somehow, each is a magic bullet that's going to change their business. But I mean, you're the guy. MarTech's been one of your main interests for years, since it was still very kind of in its nascent stages. So am I being unfair, or is that a reasonable characterization?
Well, I think if you're referring to a situation where a company says, or a marketing department says, this year, let's do conversational marketing. And that's their goal. And, it's not clear whether or not conversational marketing is going to add value. It's going to generate, a better customer experience, any of that stuff. So people make that a goal, and they don't really understand what the value of that is to the customer. So, I think in general, we have to start to rethink the way we solve problems on the sales and marketing and customer service side. So conversational marketing and chatbots is a good example of one of those shiny gadgets, one of those things that it's the latest thing and everybody's jumping on the bandwagon because they feel like, they're going to be left behind if they don't.
Right.
And it's not that there isn't a problem, that conversational marketing can solve, because customers are often frustrated by delayed or irrelevant answers to their questions. But just because you can do something, that doesn't mean you necessarily should do it.
Right.
And that's what I'm talking about. So, if you find that visitors and customers just aren't used to, or maybe they shy away from using those digital tools, it may not be that effective. So you really need to find out. You need to ask your customers. You need to do some limited experiments, but going all in on a technology just because it's the latest thing makes no sense at all. So in terms of corporate planning and budgeting, you have to ask yourself, is this tool or tactic going to resolve our challenges? And if so, how well is it going to work? If there's no clear answer, and if it's just kind of the next cool thing, then it's probably not worth the investment in the time and the money, at least until things change, until the market changes or your customers change. And that can happen. So you got to keep an eye on these things. But I think the trap we fall into is that easy purchase. SaaS companies make it, the freemium model is just so easy to just get in and do a trial, test of the technology, and you don't end up spending any money. You don't have to change your corporate IT infrastructure. They have relatively easy, onboarding, training, and so on. So it's kind of easy to fall into that trap, especially if, individual users are kind of free to do whatever they want, and there isn't any kind of corporate guidelines about evaluating technology before you dive in. So both of those things can end up, going down a rabbit hole and costing the company time and money. So I think in the end, buyer expectations, Google changes, and all those things that happen, every year, really almost on a daily basis, you need to keep an eye on those things, and you need to evaluate the technology that's available or coming up, and come up with a plan. Have an orderly process, maybe that involves some sort of evaluation form, some kind of process that people go through to propose a new technology, get it reviewed, get it tested out over a limited time frame, and come up with some results that management can review and evaluate. And then, longer term, things like the acquisition of Marketo recently by Adobe, those are things you need to keep an eye on too, because they could affect, anyone who's using marketing automation may be impacted, especially in the 2 to 3 year time frame. So keeping an eye, really ideally, you would want someone in charge of this whole MarTech process, kind of a MarTech manager whose job is to keep an eye on all these things and make sure you're doing the right thing. And I think if you can do that, you can avoid some of those cost overruns, wasted time, and strategic dead ends that really happen quite often in this process.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're describing, maybe kind of annual revisit some of your key pieces, monthly or continuously be looking for new stuff, and then perhaps quarterly you have a meeting where you decide about implementation. And probably an important question to ask is, what happens if we don't do it? Everyone says, oh, this can be great because if we do it, we can do this. But the flip side to that sometimes is, what's the downside if we don't? Is it just FOMO, or is there actually a business downside to not doing it? So I guess if I hear what you're saying, it's basically set a budget for tools, identify the limitations with the current tools, figure out the gaps that you have in the current tools that are going to be important to plug, again, toward those strategic goals, not toward, what's hip or fun, and then continuously observe, watching for new tools as they come out and develop in response to changing buyer behaviors. Is that a fair recap?
Yeah, I think so. So that really means budgeting needs to reflect the flexibility of your whole go-to-market strategy, sales, right, marketing, and customer service. And they need to be working together and adjusting that whole approach during the year, and then being accountable to management, at a budget level and also at a manpower level. So all of that makes a lot better sort of merging between strategy and planning, as you were discussing earlier. Those things can flow together nicely if you do things and stay up to date on them.
And the budgeting, it's got to be serious. I mean, it can be deceptive with SaaS software. Oh, well, it only costs us, $10 a user. But then as you look at volume use and more seats, those numbers can become substantial. So much of this discussion is focused on the customer-facing department having a clear strategy as their North Stars. That reiterates our emphasis on the importance of marketing and sales and customer service really collaborating together. Unfortunately, in many cases, they don't. And, if the corporate strategy that ought to be clearly articulated and provide that North Star isn't there, if instead they just get something like, we want 15% growth, how does a marketing department do this annual planning process in a way that will deliver growth as opposed to just checking the box?
Well, that can be really tough. As you said, a lot of departments, a lot of companies aren't used to working this way. They're used to working independently and kind of fighting over budget. So, I think that's a good first step if you can sort of get that alignment and get the heads of those departments really working together, because they have to, working on a common playbook. That's one start to this solution. But they, again, they're not used to doing that, and there may not be that kind of emphasis for management or even, structure for management. So they may need to bring in an outside consultant or agency to help them with this. And that's kind of where you come in, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in many cases, but it doesn't, as much as I'd love for it to be a consultant or an agency, it doesn't necessarily need to be. The point is that they can't skip the step, because otherwise you just end up talking about a hodgepodge of tactics in the abstract, and the only KPIs that you can measure are some that, may not be relevant. Total leads created, yeah, it's meaningful, but is it driving the business? I think that if a good CMO is under pressure increasingly to be a strategic contributor to the company, to take a lead, to earn that seat, at the table in the C-suite. And so I think a CMO can lead this process. They can do things like they can identify new markets for entry based on data they're collecting. They can proactively make those kinds of suggestions. They can find product and revenue and business model opportunities for the future by watching what's happening around them in other industries, adjacent industries, whatever. They can bring these ideas to their colleagues, propose them and introduce them, and provide examples of the kind of work that the marketing department would do in the ensuing year if the company as a whole collectively agreed that some of these were appropriate priorities. They could, I think, even overcome some of the fixed mindset that often exists in organizations where, if it's easy to say, well, we don't get strategic guidance, all we get told is number of leads, that's all the information we have, so we just have to work within that. And that's kind of a cop-out. The growth mindset says the CMO, in the absence of it from the board or from the CEO or from the C-suite in general, the CMO has an opportunity to adopt a growth mindset and take a leading role as a strategy thought leader. And then once they've proposed and justified strategy, if it's adopted, then they do their planning process to map how the department resources will be used to support those goals and what resources they need. But here we come full circle back to that question of annual planning. And we started off saying, is it the appropriate model? Is it often enough? Is it too often? And we haven't really answered that yet. I would say that annual planning is not going to go away. You have to have something on an annual tempo. It just that fits in terms of budgeting and everything else. But it's not robust enough. In my experience, the way most companies just do it is not robust enough. And nor is a year short enough for most tactical execution and campaign planning with things as fluid as they are. So I think boiling it down, my answer is strategy needs to happen. I ought to be looking at somewhere 3, 5, 10 years, depending on your industry. Annual planning should be focused on the high-level resources and areas of focus that are going to support meeting those goals over 12 months. And clear KPIs should be established to make sure that's on track. And then quarterly, there ought to be a review of market changes and progress toward the KPIs. And monthly, I think there should be a review to adapt the tactical approaches that are being used. Again, you've got years doing this and watching this evolve. Do you think that's a fair approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, the question is, will the CMO really take that opportunity, and does he or she need someone who's independent and looking at the big picture to help them with that kind of corporate overview.
Right.
If not, I mean, if they're perfectly capable of it, then that's great, but they may need that help because it's a big deal. It's a multi-layered process. It has a clear focus on the corporate goals, which is something they should be familiar with, but all these sort of underlying things that need to happen, they may not quite understand, especially kind of when is it the right time to have a meeting and what is that meeting about and things along those lines. So
Right.
I still think an independent consultant, in many cases can help with this sort of, success in this opportunity. So,
Right.
Anyway, so why don't you take it from there?
Yeah. So I think you're right. I love hearing you talk about the value of a consultant to come in and do it. And I've seen it work. I mean, I've seen the impact that great consulting can make in really enriching the strategy that undergirds the marketing planning and marketing activities. The other thing is, as I think about it, we just naturally, in today's world, we tend to make everything binary. Annual planning is good or annual planning is a waste. And of course, just as it's a red herring in most, political and social issues where you hear it described that way, it's unrealistic here as well. I mean, why not make annual planning something that improves business and outcomes rather than just an administrative step, as it sadly often is? Here we are in third quarter, people are gearing up for annual planning, and come January, they'll be just doing their stuff again.
Right on. Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm John, and together Ed and I are Common Sense.
And if you've enjoyed this, you can get periodic doses of these kinds of discussions by subscribing to our weekly videos and podcasts. You can do that at YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform. And just search for Common Sense, and you'll find us there. And if you want to take a deep dive, then check out our book that we recently published, which you can buy on Amazon by going to commonsenserevenuegrowth.com. So see you next week.